Hi students, this is Unit 3 Notes 4, Balancing Act. And this is all about compromises over slavery. We'll be using pages 9 and 10 in our notes today. You would want a highlighter for the important vocabulary as well as a pencil to fill in the blanks. So today we're going to be looking at 3 different compromises that happened as a result of slavery. We have the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we have some situations that occurred that prompted the government to make some of these compromises happen. The first situation, Missouri had asked Congress to become a state. The people of Missouri have decided that slavery will be permitted there. Many slave owners already lived in Missouri. Northern congressmen speak out against allowing the territory to enter the Union as a slave state, since it would mean that there would be more slave states than free states. About the same time, Maine asks if they can become separate from Massachusetts and become their own states. So Missouri asks Congress to become a state. The people of Missouri decided that slavery would be permitted. Okay, Northern people are speaking out against that. So the Northerners, Congress should admit Missouri, but only as a free state. Louisiana has already become a slave state. Maine must be admitted as a free state. And then the South is saying that Congress should admit Missouri to the Union as a slave state because that's what people in Missouri want. And if Northerners are allowed to settle in Louisiana territory, the Southern slave owners must be allowed to settle there too. So they're talking about, give states and the people what they want, whereas the Northerners are saying, there's already been slave states given, so now we have to have some free states too. So they come up with the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was proposed by Senator Henry Clay, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to keep the balance of power in Congress equal between slave and free states. Congress also drew a line across the Louisiana Territory, right in here. Louisiana Territory is this whole area up here. Okay, so they drew a line across here, an imaginary line, okay, that said, except for Missouri, every state north of that line is to be a free state. So the compromise, what was it? The Missouri Compromise, your first vocab term, is an agreement made by Congress in 1820 to make Maine, way up here, a free state, and Missouri a slave state, and then also banning slavery north of here. Okay. The big thing was keeping the balance. There's 11 free states, 11 slave states. So the Missouri Compromise, at the bottom of page 9, the date was 1820. It helped free states in the north because Maine was added as a free state, and they banned slavery north of that 36-degree latitude line. But it also helped slave states in the south because Missouri was added as a slave state.
To understand what the Missouri Compromise is and why it's so significant in American history, we have to take it back about 200 years. Now, let me set the stage for you. The year is 1820. The U.S. is a young nation with 22 states, 11 free states in the north and 11 slave states in the south. But this balance is called into question when Missouri, a piece of land acquired from the Louisiana Purchase, wanted to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. Slavery was a highly contentious issue in the U.S. at this point. Some were pushing for the total abolition of slavery, while others looked to expand it. This issue pinned families and states against each other, creating a powder keg just waiting to explode. With tensions already high, the idea of Missouri entering as a slave state prompted heated debate in Congress and throughout the nation, too. Not just about Missouri, of course, but also how slavery factored into all future states and the future of the nation. Many argued over whether Congress even had the right to spread or limit slavery in the United States at all. While Northerners argued Congress should be allowed to prohibit slavery, Southerners insisted on popular sovereignty, the idea that it should be up to the states to determine this for themselves. These sentiments sound familiar? The biggest sticking point of the debate was political power. You see, Missouri's entrance as a slave state would throw off the balance of power in Congress. So to keep things even, Congress hashed out a separate solution, a compromise of sorts. In exchange for Missouri's admission as a slave state, the Northern Territory of Maine would be admitted as a free state. This ensured equal representation between the North and the South. A second part of the compromise banned slavery throughout the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of latitude line 3630. But while the Missouri Compromise limited the spread of slavery, it did nothing to abolish slavery in states that already had it. So while in some ways it staved off a civil war, it was only because it just maintained the status quo. The admission of Missouri as a slave state only fanned the flames of the national debate over slavery, a fierce disagreement that wouldn't be resolved until the end of the Civil War. Understand what the
Okay, so that was the Missouri Compromise. The next problem that we have is this. As a result of winning the Mexican-American War, the United States has acquired a huge territory known as the Mexican Cession. A decision must be made as to whether slavery will be allowed or not in these new lands. The Northern congressmen want slavery banned in the nation's capital. The Southern congressmen want runaway slaves to be returned to their owners. So everybody wants something. We got a couple things here. First of all, we got the Mexican-American War, like that Mexican Cession land. What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about D.C., our nation's capital? Are we going to allow slavery or not? Southern congressmen want runaway slaves to be returned to their owners. Texas has recently been added as a slave state, and California has just asked to be admitted as a free state. Wow, that's a lot going on in this problem here. So, Northern congressmen are saying that slavery should not be allowed anywhere in the Mexican Cession. They're also saying that the sale of slaves in the District of Columbia, where the nation's capital is located, ought to be against the law, and that California should be a free state. The Southerners are saying that they need more land for cotton growers and they need slaves to work the cotton fields, so slavery should get to continue in the South. They're saying if California enters as a free state, the free states will have a 2-vote advantage in the Senate, and that would not be fair. And Southerners are saying that something must be done to punish Northerners who help slaves escape. So a stronger fugitive slave law is needed, because they don't think it's fair that the Northerners helped slaves escape. So they came up with the Compromise of 1850. So once again, we have Kentucky Senator Henry Clay offering a compromise that he thought would have something that would please everyone. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state to please the North. It's going to allow Utah and New Mexico territories to decide whether to allow slavery. That'll make the South happy. While slave owners in Maryland would be able to keep their slaves, the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C. And then the compromise also added the Fugitive Slave Act to make it easier for slave owners to find and reclaim escaped slaves. Holy cow, this is a lot of stuff into this compromise, you guys. So we've got the Compromise of 1850. California is going to become a free state. New Mexico and Utah are going to decide whether or not to allow slavery. And then the other piece there in the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act. What this means, in a nutshell, is that Northerners would be forced to help return runaway slaves to the South. So citizens are required to help catch and return runaway slaves. And if you let somebody get away, you could be fined $1,000 and spend up to 6 months in jail. But what's wonky about this is that there's a special court that was used to hear cases against accused runaway slaves. So for each slave returned to his or her owner, the judge is going to get paid $10. But if the judge ruled that the person was free, he would be paid $5 for his service. So if a black person's brought into that court, the judge gets $10 if he says that they're a slave, or $5 if he says they're free. That's corrupt. Northerners obviously hated the Fugitive Slave Act. Southerners felt the law was justified because they felt that slaves were property. So Southern slave catchers would roam the North, sometimes capturing free African Americans. And this Fugitive Slave Act is what inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. What this means, too, is that with the Underground Railroad, slaves couldn't just escape to the North. They have to go all the way to Canada. So the Compromise of 1850, which was in 1850, helped the free states because California became a free state and slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. But it also helped the South, the slave states, because New Mexico and Utah settlers would get to vote and the Fugitive Slave Act was established.
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Fugitive Slave Act. To begin, all of it goes back to the Constitution. Article 4 of the Constitution has a clause that we call the Fugitive Slave Clause, which orders states to deliver up fugitives from labor, the euphemism for runaway slaves, when they are requested by slaveholders. That clause gets translated into the first 1793 statute, which is a civil statute about the returning of these fugitives from labor. That was a law that wasn't well enforced according to Southern slaveholders. They complained about it bitterly, especially in the 1840s, and that's what led to the creation of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that was part of the Compromise of 1850. This 1850 statute, this was much tougher than the earlier one. They punished people who harbored runaways, members of the Underground Railroad, with both civil penalties and criminal penalties, including up to 6 months imprisonment if they were caught and prosecuted successfully. This was a very controversial measure. It was draconian in theory, but in practice, it wasn't well enforced. The Underground Railroad was alive and well in the North in the 1850s. There are more documented escapes than rendition hearings in the years before the Civil War. There were dozens and dozens of people who were tortured and imprisoned in the South because of helping fugitives, but not under federal law, under state slave stealing statutes. The lack of enforcement of this federal law is what led many southern states to complain in their secession ordinance, for example, in 1860 and 61. What they were complaining about was northern state laws that they thought interfered with the federal system. These are called personal liberty laws, anti-kidnapping statutes that many northern states passed to try to protect Black people from being unfairly accused of being runaways. Ultimately, the fugitive crisis is one of the major causes of the coming of the Civil War. Young people in large numbers. Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker.
With that Fugitive Slave Act, like one of the big causes of, or what the South fought for in the Civil War was states' rights. And they felt like all of these state laws and such were being tramped all over, right, stomped on, and that they weren't having the right as a state that they should have according to the Constitution to make their own rules. So that is one of the reasons why we do go to war, and a big part of that is this Fugitive Slave Act. So, situation 3. Here's another problem. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois has proposed a bill to Congress hoping to build a railroad to California. The project is more likely to happen if the areas in the Great Plains are organized into two formal territories, Kansas and Nebraska. The Southern congressmen want slavery to be allowed in the new territories. Northern congressmen argued with the Missouri Compromise already established that these territories would be free. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court established that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it decided the fates of states that did not exist yet. Okay, we've got a lot to unpack here. So we need to build the railroad. They're saying that they want to make two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Okay, and they're saying because of the Missouri Compromise, which drew that line, okay, at the latitude line, they said that all the Kansas and Nebraska should automatically be free because they're north of that line. Okay. But the Southerners are saying, no, that's not fair, basically. Okay. So the Supreme Court then establishes that the Missouri Compromise that was created in 1820, that compromise really is not constitutional because we can't decide on something that wasn't created yet. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act had a compromise. The Senator Stephen A. Douglas tried to make both the Northern and Southern congressmen happy by adding changes to his bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This would allow the settlers in the new territories to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. To calm the Northerners, Douglas argued the climate of new territories is not suitable for growing crops that relied on slave labor. This act replaced the Missouri Compromise that had banned slavery north of the 36-degree latitude line. And that made Southerners happy because they got rid of the Missouri Compromise. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that settlers would get to determine whether or not slavery would be allowed. All right, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act helped free states in the North because settlers in each territory would vote on the issue of slavery. And it helped slave states of the South because it abolished or got rid of the Missouri Compromise.
Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's probably the most important piece of legislation in the antebellum period. Now, the Civil War story is about the breakup of the Union, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act is probably best understood as a story about the breakup of the Democratic Party. It was introduced in January of 1854 by Stephen Douglas. He was a Democratic senator from Illinois. He was trying to help the country spread westward. He was trying to position himself for national power. He was trying to overcome the sectional disputes that were still lingering in the aftermath of the Compromise of 1850. And so what he was really trying to do was figure out a way to organize the territories in the former Louisiana Purchase, in the area between the Mississippi and Missouri River and the Pacific coast, in a way that would overcome all of the debates about the future of slavery. And his solution ultimately was what he called popular sovereignty. Let the people who live there decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. This violated the principle of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had said that all of the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri, the 3630 line, would be restricted to the spread of slavery. There were plenty of Democrats in the North who hated that decision. They fought it, they criticized it. But Douglas worked with the Democratic president, Franklin Pierce, and they made it a test of their party to support this legislation. The Northern Democratic Party was decimated by this. It was broken apart. Many of those former Democrats, a lot of anti-slavery Democrats, they then migrated into a new coalition, the emerging Republican Party. Once it was in place, one of the preconditions necessary for what would become not just the breakup of a political party, but the breakup of the Union. Young people in large numbers. Hi, my name is Matthew Pinsker.
Okay, so we need to talk about what happened to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As a result of this, settlers flooded into Kansas. Most of them were simply farmers looking for good farmland and a chance to live a peaceful life in this new territory. But some settlers moved to Kansas either to support or oppose slavery. Abolitionists raised money to send weapons to anti-slavery settlers. Southern towns took up collections to send their young men to Kansas. Because the settlers would vote on the slavery issue, people crossed the border into Kansas to influence the election. Soon, there were two governments established in Kansas. One was pro-slavery, the other was anti-slavery. We call them border ruffians from Missouri invaded Lawrence, Kansas, and they attacked the anti-slavery government. Days later, the fiery abolitionist John Brown led a raid in the pro-slavery town of Potawatomi. The 3 years of violence in Kansas was called Bleeding Kansas. So basically, people were trying to move into the area just to vote whether to make it slave or free. Okay, and this led to violent attacks between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, and we call that Bleeding Kansas. And then we have the rise of the Republican Party. This political party was started in 1854, and the idea was that these anti-slavery activists are going to prevent slavery from spreading to the Western territories. The new Republican Party was united that no man, under the belief that no man can own another man. This political movement felt that slavery must be prohibited in the territories and that all future new states must be free states. This political party also felt that African Americans deserved all the rights of citizenship, even after the Supreme Court had ruled Black people were not citizens and had no legal rights. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln to run for Senate against Stephen Douglas. He lost that election, but it helped Abraham Lincoln become a national figure, and it became clear that compromise over slavery was becoming impossible. And this concludes Notes for Balancing Act.